They said no one lives up there anymore, but we heard screaming. And it wasn't animals.
The hollows of Appalachia, where civilization fades into shadow and ancient superstitions still hold sway, something darker than poverty ever took root. Between the Civil War and the 1980s, those remote mountains became breeding grounds for religious movements so twisted, so violent, that their very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about faith in America. Today, we're descending into the forgotten valleys, where charismatic leaders turned scripture into weapons, where entire communities vanished without explanation, and where the line between salvation and damnation became so blurred that even seasoned investigators fled in terror. So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. These weren't your typical religious communities. These were isolated kingdoms ruled by self-proclaimed prophets who combined biblical scripture with mountain folklore, creating belief systems so dangerous that federal agents often refuse to investigate alone. We're talking about cults that practiced ritual sacrifice, communities where children were raised as weapons, and leaders who convinced hundreds of followers that the outside world had already ended. The stories I'm about to share were deliberately buried by authorities who decided some truths were too disturbing for public consumption. 6 cults, 6 nightmares hidden in America's oldest mountains. 6 reasons why even today, certain valleys remain off-limits to outsiders. 1. The Serpent's Covenant of Blackwater Ridge. In the summer of 1923, a traveling preacher named Jeremiah Thorne arrived in the remote settlement of Blackwater Ridge, West Virginia, carrying nothing but a worn Bible and a burlap sack that seemed to move on its own. The locals, desperate for spiritual guidance during the harsh economic times, welcomed him with open arms. They had no idea they were inviting something far more ancient and hungry than any ordinary man of God. Thorne's sermons began normally enough, focusing on traditional Appalachian themes of sin, redemption, and the coming apocalypse. But within weeks, his teachings took a disturbing turn. He claimed to have received visions during his travels through the deepest mountain caves, visions that revealed the true nature of salvation. According to Thorne, conventional Christianity had it backwards. The serpent in the Garden of Eden wasn't the tempter, but the liberator. The snake had tried to free humanity from a jealous God's tyranny, and now, in these end times, the serpent would return to claim its rightful place as humanity's savior. The congregation was initially skeptical, but Thorne possessed an almost supernatural charisma. His voice could shift from gentle whisper to thunderous roar in the span of a single sentence. More unsettling were his demonstrations. During services, he would reach into his mysterious sack and withdraw massive timber rattlesnakes, creatures that should have been hibernating in the mountain caves. These serpents, instead of striking, would coil around his arms and neck like living jewelry, their eyes fixed on the mesmerized congregation. Within a year, Thorne had converted the entire settlement. The Serpent's Covenant, as they called themselves, abandoned traditional Christian practices entirely. Sunday services became elaborate rituals where members would handle increasingly dangerous snakes while speaking in tongues. But the serpents weren't just props in their worship. They were considered sacred beings, oracles that could predict the future and judge the faithfulness of believers. Members who the snakes refused to touch were cast out of the community, often found days later in the surrounding woods, their bodies bearing bite marks from creatures that left no venom. The ritual practices grew more extreme as Thorne's influence deepened. He taught that pain was the pathway to enlightenment, that suffering purified the soul and brought believers closer to the serpent's wisdom. Members began scarifying themselves with ritual knives, creating intricate patterns on their skin that Thorne claimed were messages from the serpent realm. Children as young as 6 were expected to participate, their small hands guided by adults as they carved symbols into their own flesh. By 1925, the Serpent's Covenant had attracted attention from neighboring communities, but not for the reasons you might expect. People began reporting miraculous healings in Blackwater Ridge. Visitors with terminal illnesses would arrive dying and leave completely restored. Word spread through the mountain communities like wildfire, and soon pilgrims were hiking for days to reach Thorne's settlement. What they found there defied explanation. The healing ceremonies took place in a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, where hundreds of serpents had made their home among the rock formations. Sick pilgrims would lie in the center while Thorne and his followers released dozens of snakes onto their bodies. The serpents would slither across the afflicted areas, their tongues flicking out to taste the illness. Witnesses described seeing tumors shrink before their eyes, watching paralyzed limbs regain movement, witnessing blind eyes suddenly focus with perfect clarity. But the healings came with a price that became apparent only gradually. Those who had been healed reported strange side effects in the months following their treatment. Their body temperature dropped several degrees below normal, making them cold to the touch. They developed an aversion to bright light, preferring to remain in darkened spaces. Most disturbing of all, they began experiencing shared dreams, visions of vast underground caverns where massive serpents coiled around pillars of black stone while human figures danced in worship. The final documented visitor to Blackwater Ridge was a federal marshal named Thomas Caldwell, who arrived in October 1926 to investigate reports of missing persons. His official report, filed 3 days later, described a community that had undergone a fundamental transformation. The settlement's buildings remained, but they had been modified in ways that hurt to look at directly. Doorways had been reshaped into curved openings that resembled serpent mouths. Windows had been replaced with intricate patterns of holes that created the illusion of scales when viewed from a distance. Caldwell reported finding the residents in a state of religious ecstasy that had apparently lasted for weeks. They moved with fluid, serpentine motions, their heads swaying in unison as they hummed melodies that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. When he attempted to speak with them, they responded only by extending their tongues, which had somehow become forked and elongated. Children played games that involved twisting their bodies into impossible positions, their spines seeming to bend in ways that should have been fatal. Most terrifying was his description of Jeremiah Thorne himself. The preacher had undergone a physical transformation that Caldwell struggled to describe in his report. His skin had taken on a scaled appearance, and his eyes had developed vertical pupils that tracked movement with predatory precision. When Thorne spoke, His voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, creating an echo effect that made conversation nearly impossible. He moved without walking, seeming to glide across the ground with no visible means of propulsion. Caldwell's investigation was cut short when he discovered what remained of the missing persons in a cavern beneath the settlement. The cave system extended far deeper than any natural formation should have, its walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. The missing individuals had been transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. They retained their basic shape, but had developed additional joints in their limbs, allowing them to move through the narrow cave passages with disturbing efficiency. The marshal's final report recommended that the area be quarantined and the cave system sealed with explosives. However, when a military demolition team arrived 2 weeks later, they found Blackwater Ridge completely abandoned. The building stood empty, showing no signs of hurried departure. Personal belongings remained in place, meals sat half-finished on tables, but every living soul had vanished without a trace. More puzzling was the discovery that the cave system had been sealed from the inside. Tons of rock had been carefully arranged to block every entrance, creating barriers that would have required heavy machinery to construct. The work showed a level of precision and planning that suggested the residents had known exactly when to disappear and how to cover their tracks. The area remained under federal observation for several years, but no further activity was reported. The buildings gradually fell into disrepair, reclaimed by the mountain wilderness. However, local hikers and hunters continued to report strange encounters in the region. They described finding shed skins of enormous serpents, far larger than any species native to the area. Some reported hearing hymns echoing from deep within the mountain, songs sung in harmonies that seemed to require more voices than any human choir could provide. 2. The Blood Covenant of Widow's Hollow. In the winter of 1934, as the Great Depression reached its deepest point, a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Marsh established a religious community in the isolated valley known as Widow's Hollow, nestled deep within the Virginia Blue Ridge. Marsh promised his followers that through perfect faith and absolute submission to God's will, they could transcend the suffering of the mortal world and achieve a state of divine grace that would protect them from all earthly hardships. The community initially attracted families fleeing the economic devastation of the Depression. Marsh's teachings seemed to offer hope in hopeless times, emphasizing that poverty and suffering were tests of faith that would ultimately lead to spiritual rewards. His followers, numbering nearly 200 at the community's peak, lived in simple wooden structures arranged in concentric circles around a central meeting hall where Marsh delivered his increasingly radical sermons. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of Marsh's dietary restrictions. He claimed to have received divine revelation that certain foods contained spiritual impurities that would prevent believers from achieving true enlightenment. The prohibited list grew longer each week, eventually including most fruits, vegetables, and grains. The community's diet was reduced to a few approved items, supplemented by a special communion wine that Marsh personally prepared in secret. What followers didn't realize was that Marsh's communion wine contained more than fermented grapes. Laboratory analysis conducted decades later would reveal traces of psychoactive compounds derived from local mushrooms and plants, substances that induced profound hallucinations and made recipients highly susceptible to suggestion. The weekly communion services became increasingly intense as members experienced shared visions of angels and demons, biblical scenes playing out in vivid detail before their eyes. As the community became more isolated from the outside world, Marsh's teachings took a darker turn. He began preaching about the necessity of blood sacrifice to achieve true communion with the divine. Initially, this involved the ritual slaughter of livestock during elaborate ceremonies where members would drink the warm blood while reciting passages from Leviticus. Marsh claimed that consuming the life force of sacrificed animals would purify their souls and grant them supernatural abilities. The rituals escalated when Marsh announced that animal sacrifice was merely preparation for the ultimate test of faith. He revealed that God had commanded him to identify the most faithful members of the community, those pure enough to serve as vessels for divine transformation. These chosen individuals would undergo a sacred ritual that would allow them to transcend their mortal bodies and join the heavenly host as living angels. The first transformation ceremony took place on the winter solstice of 1935. A young woman named Sarah Whitman, who had been fasting for weeks in preparation, was brought before the assembled community. Marsh had convinced her that she was destined to become a bridge between the earthly and divine realms, that her sacrifice would open the gates of heaven for all believers. The ceremony began with hours of chanting and the consumption of increasing quantities of the drugged communion wine. As the ritual reached its climax, Marsh produced a ceremonial dagger that he claimed had been blessed by the Archangel Michael himself. The blade was ornately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. Sarah, deep in a trance-like state, willingly offered her wrist to the blade as the congregation sang hymns of praise. Her blood was collected in ornate chalices and distributed among the members, who believed that drinking it would grant them a portion of her divine essence. But Sarah didn't die as expected. Instead, she entered a catatonic state that lasted for 3 days, during which Marsh claimed she was visiting the throne of God and receiving divine instructions. When she finally awakened, she seemed fundamentally changed. Her voice carried an otherworldly quality that made listeners feel compelled to obey her every word. Her eyes had taken on an unsettling luminescence that was visible even in bright daylight. Most disturbing of all, her wounds had healed with impossible speed, leaving behind scarred patterns that resembled wings. Word of Sarah's transformation spread through the community like wildfire. Members became convinced that they were witnessing genuine miracles, that their faith had been rewarded with divine intervention. More volunteers stepped forward, eager to undergo the transformation ceremony themselves. Over the following months, nearly 50 members participated in the ritual, each experiencing their own version of the mysterious change. The transformed members formed an inner circle within the community, serving as Marsh's most trusted advisors and enforcers. They claimed to possess prophetic abilities, accurately predicting weather patterns, illness outbreaks, and other events that affected the community. Their influence grew as ordinary members sought their guidance on everything from crop planting to marriage decisions. But their predictions came with an unsettling accuracy that suggested knowledge no human should possess. Dr. Margaret Holloway, a psychiatrist who later studied the surviving records, noted that the transformed members exhibited classic symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, but with unusual consistency in their shared delusions. They all reported experiencing visions of the same otherworldly realm, described identical angelic beings, and claimed to receive messages from the same divine sources. The psychological synchronization suggested either elaborate coaching or something far more disturbing. The community's isolation became complete when Marsh declared that the outside world was preparing to launch an attack on their sacred valley. He claimed that government agents and religious authorities had formed an alliance to destroy their divine mission, that federal forces were already gathering in the surrounding mountains. The community began preparing for siege, stockpiling weapons, and constructing defensive fortifications around their settlement. Members were forbidden from leaving the valley under any circumstances, and visitors were turned away at gunpoint. The few local residents who attempted to check on friends and family members within the community were met with hostility from armed guards who claimed that outsiders carried spiritual contamination that could destroy their hard-won purity. The community had effectively become a fortress, cut off from all contact with the outside world. The end came suddenly in the spring of 1937. A forest fire, sparked by an unusually dry winter, swept through the valley with devastating speed. When fire crews finally reached the settlement, they found a scene that defied explanation. The buildings had been arranged in perfect geometric patterns, as if the residents had spent their final hours organizing their community according to some divine blueprint. Bodies were discovered in ritualistic positions, arranged in circles around small altars where the transformed members had apparently conducted final ceremonies. Most disturbing was the discovery that many of the bodies showed signs of systematic blood loss, but not from the fire. Careful examination revealed that the residents had participated in a mass bloodletting ritual in the hours before the flames arrived. The transformed members had apparently convinced the community that the fire was a divine test, that by offering their blood to heaven, they could ascend to paradise while their earthly bodies were consumed by purifying flames. The investigation that followed was quickly classified by federal authorities, but leaked documents revealed details that challenged conventional understanding of mass suicide events. The bloodletting had been conducted with surgical precision, suggesting medical knowledge that none of the community members were known to possess. The geometric arrangement of the buildings required mathematical calculations far beyond the educational level of the residents. Most puzzling of all, several of the transformed members were never found among the dead, despite witness accounts placing them at the scene during the final hours. Local search teams reported strange discoveries in the months following the fire. They found caves in the surrounding mountains that had been carved with intricate symbols matching those described in Marsh's sermons. These caverns contained what appeared to be shrines made from human bones, arranged in patterns that created optical illusions when viewed from specific angles. The bone arrangements seemed to tell a story, depicting the transformation of human figures into winged beings ascending toward a carved representation of heaven. 3. The Eternal Flame Ministry of Copper Creek. In the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, where coal mining had left the landscape scarred and the communities desperate, a former mine foreman named Isaiah Blackwood established what he called the Eternal Flame Ministry in 1941. Blackwood claimed to have received visions while trapped in a mine collapse, visions that revealed the true purpose of fire in God's plan for humanity. His followers, drawn primarily from unemployed miners and their families, believed they had found a leader who understood their suffering and could guide them to salvation. The ministry's central teaching revolved around the concept of purification through flame. Blackwood preached that fire was the physical manifestation of divine love, that God's presence could be felt most directly through controlled exposure to sacred flames. He taught that the human body was a vessel filled with spiritual impurities that could only be burned away through ritualistic encounters with blessed fire. Members who submitted to these purification ceremonies would achieve a state of perfect grace that would protect them from all earthly harm. The early rituals were relatively mild, involving brief exposure to candle flames and the handling of heated metal objects during prayer services. Members would pass their hands through flames while reciting biblical passages, believing that their faith would protect them from serious burns. Blackwood demonstrated remarkable resistance to fire damage, walking barefoot across beds of hot coals and holding burning torches with his bare hands while showing no signs of pain or injury. As word of these demonstrations spread through the mining communities, desperate families began making pilgrimages to Copper Creek. The region had been devastated by mine closures and black lung disease, leaving entire generations without hope or purpose. Blackwood's promise of divine protection resonated powerfully with people who had watched their loved ones suffocate slowly from coal dust, who had seen their children born into poverty with no prospect of escape. The ministry's compound grew rapidly, with new wooden structures built in a distinctive style that incorporated metal elements designed to conduct and channel heat. Each building featured elaborate chimney systems and fire pits that remained perpetually lit, creating an atmosphere where flames were always visible and the scent of burning wood permeated everything. Members were expected to maintain these sacred fires as part of their daily devotions, feeding them with specially prepared mixtures of coal, wood, and mysterious substances that Blackwood claimed had been blessed through divine revelation. Within 2 years, the Eternal Flame Ministry had attracted over 300 followers, many of whom had abandoned their homes and possessions to join the community. They lived in dormitory-style buildings, segregated by gender, with families separated except during worship services. Blackwood taught that traditional family bonds were obstacles to achieving true spiritual unity, that members must love the ministry above all earthly relationships. Children were raised communally, taught from infancy that their biological parents were merely vessels who had brought them to the sacred flame. The purification ceremonies became increasingly extreme as Blackwood's influence deepened. Members progressed through levels of fire exposure, each stage requiring greater faith and endurance. Advanced practitioners would plunge their hands into molten metal, walk through walls of flame, and sleep on beds of hot coals. Those who showed fear or hesitation were subjected to additional purification sessions, forced to repeat the rituals until they achieved the proper state of spiritual submission. Medical records from the period obtained through Freedom of Information requests decades later, reveal that the nearby hospital treated an unusually high number of severe burn victims during the early 1940s. However, these patients displayed puzzling characteristics that baffled doctors. Their burns healed with remarkable speed, often leaving behind scar tissue that formed intricate patterns resembling flames or religious symbols. More disturbing, many of these patients seemed to experience no pain from their injuries, remaining conscious and alert, even with third-degree burns covering significant portions of their bodies. Dr. Elizabeth Hammond, who worked at the regional hospital during this period, later described treating ministry members who appeared to be in a constant state of religious ecstasy. They would speak in tongues while their wounds were being cleaned, claiming to feel God's presence flowing through their injuries. Some insisted that their burns were actually cool to the touch, that the fire had transformed their flesh into something beyond normal human tissue. Hammond noted that these patients had unusually high body temperatures, often running fevers that should have been fatal but seemed to cause no distress. The ministry's most disturbing practice involved the creation of what Blackwood called flame prophets, members who had undergone such extensive fire exposure that they claimed to have achieved permanent communion with the divine. These individuals lived in special quarters near the compound's central fire pit, where they maintained constant contact with flames through various apparatus that Blackwood had designed. They wore robes that had been treated with chemicals to make them flame resistant, allowing them to sit directly in fires while delivering prophecies and spiritual guidance to other members. The flame prophets spoke of visions that extended far beyond traditional Christian imagery. They described vast underground caverns filled with rivers of liquid fire, where angelic beings with skin like molten metal tended eternal forges. They claimed to have witnessed the creation of souls in these divine foundries, watching as spiritual essence was hammered into human form on anvils of burning stone. Most disturbing were their prophecies about the coming transformation of humanity, predictions that all flesh would eventually be consumed by sacred fire and reborn as beings of pure flame. These visions began to manifest in the ministry's art and architecture. Members created elaborate sculptures from melted metal and charred wood, depicting human figures in various stages of transformation by fire. The compound's buildings were modified to incorporate these artistic elements, with walls decorated by burn patterns that created optical illusions when viewed in flickering firelight. The overall effect was deeply unsettling, giving visitors the impression that the structures themselves were slowly being consumed by some invisible conflagration. By 1944, the ministry had attracted attention from federal authorities concerned about potential fire hazards and reports of child endangerment. When investigators arrived at the compound, they found a community that had undergone a profound transformation. The buildings, while still structurally sound, showed evidence of repeated fire damage that had been incorporated into their design. Scorch marks covered every surface, but in patterns so precise and deliberate that they appeared to be decorative rather than accidental. The investigators reported that the ministry members displayed unusual physical characteristics that suggested prolonged exposure to extreme heat. Their skin had taken on a leathery texture and reddish coloration that made them appear permanently sunburned. Hair growth seemed to be stunted or absent entirely in many cases, with members covering their heads with specially treated cloth that could withstand high temperatures. Most unsettling was their apparent immunity to pain from heat sources, demonstrated when several members casually reached into cooking fires to adjust burning logs with their bare hands. The flame prophets presented the most disturbing sight. These individuals had undergone such extensive physical transformation that they barely resembled normal humans. Their skin had developed a translucent quality that revealed the network of blood vessels beneath, creating patterns that resembled flames dancing across their bodies. Their eyes had taken on an orange luminescence that was visible even in daylight, and their voices carried a crackling quality that sounded like burning wood. When they spoke, small wisps of smoke seemed to emerge from their mouths, though no source of combustion was visible. The investigation was complicated by the discovery that many of the ministry's practices appeared to violate basic laws of physics. Temperature readings taken throughout the compound showed that certain areas maintained heat levels that should have been lethal to human life, yet members moved through these spaces with no apparent discomfort. Some buildings registered internal temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe burns within minutes, but families lived in these structures as if they were normal homes. More puzzling were the reports of spontaneous combustion events that seemed to occur regularly within the compound. Investigators witnessed objects bursting into flames without any apparent ignition source, fires that burned intensely for brief periods before extinguishing themselves with no damage to surrounding materials. These incidents followed patterns that suggested intelligence behind their occurrence, happening at moments that seemed designed to emphasize points during religious discussions or to punctuate Blackwood's sermons. The ministry's children presented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the investigation. These youngsters, raised from birth within the fire-obsessed community, displayed abilities that challenged conventional understanding of human physiology. They could handle burning materials without injury, sleep comfortably in temperatures that would incapacitate adults, and seemed to require significantly less food and water than normal children. Their play activities involved games that would be considered torture in any other context, but they participated with obvious enjoyment and no signs of distress. Educational assessments revealed that the children possessed extensive knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and engineering principles related to fire and heat, despite having no formal schooling. They could identify different types of flames by their color and intensity, predict how various materials would behave when exposed to specific temperatures, and construct complex heating systems using only basic materials. This knowledge seemed to be intuitive rather than learned, suggesting that their prolonged exposure to the ministry's practices had somehow altered their cognitive development. The federal investigation reached a disturbing conclusion when investigators discovered that the ministry's practices were causing genetic changes in its members. Blood samples revealed cellular mutations that appeared to be adaptive responses to extreme heat exposure, modifications that should have required thousands of years of evolutionary pressure to develop. The children showed the most dramatic changes with some displaying cellular structures that seem designed to process and utilize heat energy in ways that normal human physiology could not support. Dr. Harrison Webb, the lead investigator, filed a classified report recommending immediate intervention to prevent what he described as the emergence of a new subspecies of humanity. His findings suggested that the ministry's practices were accelerating human evolution in directions that could have profound implications for the future of the species. The report was quickly sealed by federal authorities, and the investigation was transferred to a classified program that operated under military oversight. The ministry's end came not through government intervention, but through an incident that survivors described as divine judgment. On a particularly hot summer evening in 1945, as the community gathered for their weekly purification ceremony, the central fire pit suddenly erupted in an explosion of flame that reached heights of over 50 feet. The inferno spread with impossible speed, consuming the entire compound in a matter of minutes, despite the fact that the buildings had been designed to withstand extreme heat. When rescue teams arrived, they found a scene that defied explanation. The compound had been reduced to a perfect circle of ash and melted metal, with no debris scattered beyond its boundaries. The fire had burned so intensely that it had vitrified the soil itself, creating a glass-like surface that reflected light in strange patterns. Most puzzling was the discovery that the flames had somehow burned downward into the earth, creating a crater that extended nearly 20 feet below the original ground level. The fate of the ministry's members remained a mystery that haunted investigators for decades. No human remains were found in the ash, despite the fact that over 300 people had been present during the final ceremony. The only evidence of their existence was a series of impressions burned into the vitrified ground, human-shaped shadows that seemed to show figures ascending upward into the flames. These burn patterns were so precise that they captured individual facial features and clothing details, creating a permanent record of the community's final moments. Local fire departments reported that the blaze had been visible from over 50 miles away, a column of flame that witnesses described as reaching toward the stars, like a pillar of divine light. The fire burned for exactly 7 hours before extinguishing itself completely, leaving behind no smoldering embers or residual heat. The mathematical precision of this duration seemed significant to investigators, who noted that 7 was considered a sacred number in Blackwood's teachings. In the months following the disaster, strange phenomena were reported throughout the region. Miners working in nearby coal seams discovered veins of a previously unknown mineral that glowed with its own internal light and remained warm to the touch, regardless of ambient temperature. Geologists who studied these formations found that they contained trace elements that didn't match any known substances, suggesting that the ministry's final ceremony had somehow altered the molecular structure of the surrounding rock. 4. The Hollow Earth disciples of Devil's Backbone. Deep in the treacherous terrain of Virginia's Devil's Backbone Ridge, where the mountain spine twisted like a serpent through the clouds, a former geology professor named Dr. Marcus Thornfield established what he called the Hollow Earth Disciples in 1952. Thornfield claimed to have made a revolutionary discovery during his academic research, finding evidence that the Earth was not solid, but contained vast hollow spaces inhabited by advanced civilizations that had existed since before recorded history. His followers, drawn from the ranks of educated professionals disillusioned by the atomic age, believed they had found a leader who could guide them to humanity's true origins. Thornfield's academic credentials lent credibility to his increasingly outlandish claims, and his ability to cite scientific literature while weaving elaborate mythologies convinced many that his theories represented genuine breakthroughs in understanding the nature of reality itself. The community established itself in a network of natural caves that honeycombed the Devil's Backbone Ridge, with Thornfield claiming that these caverns were actually entrances to the Hollow Earth realm. Members spent their days exploring and mapping the cave system, searching for passages that would lead them deeper into what they believed was humanity's ancestral home. The caves were indeed extensive, forming a labyrinthine network that seemed to extend far beyond what geological surveys had indicated was possible. Thornfield's teachings combined elements of ancient mythology, fringe science, and religious prophecy into a coherent belief system that explained humanity's place in a cosmic hierarchy. He claimed that the surface world was merely a testing ground where souls were prepared for eventual migration to the Hollow Earth, where they would join advanced beings who had achieved perfect harmony with the planet's spiritual essence. The atomic bomb, he argued, was a sign that surface humanity had failed this test and would soon face extinction unless they found refuge in the underground realm. The disciples' daily routine revolved around what Thornfield called depth meditation, extended periods spent in the deepest accessible parts of the cave system, where members would attempt to commune with the underground civilizations. These sessions often lasted for days, with participants reporting profound spiritual experiences that seemed to occur only in the absolute darkness of the caves. Members described hearing voices, speaking in unknown languages, seeing lights that had no visible source, and experiencing sensations of weightlessness that suggested they were somehow ascending through the Earth's layers. As the disciples spent increasing amounts of time in the cave system, they began to exhibit physical changes that Thornfield claimed were evidence of their successful adaptation to the Hollow Earth environment. Their eyes developed an enhanced ability to see in near total darkness, allowing them to navigate the caves without artificial light sources. Their hearing became so acute that they could detect the slightest vibrations through rock formations, interpreting these signals as messages from the underground civilizations. Most remarkably, their sense of direction underground became almost supernatural, with members able to navigate complex cave networks that had confounded professional spelunkers. The community's isolation deepened as Thornfield declared that surface dwellers carried spiritual contamination that could interfere with their connection to the Hollow Earth realm. Visits from outsiders were strictly forbidden, and members were required to undergo purification rituals after any contact with the surface world. These ceremonies involved extended periods of sensory deprivation in specially prepared chambers deep within the caves, where participants would fast and meditate until they achieved what Thornfield called earth harmony. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a psychiatrist who later studied the group's practices, noted that the disciples' extended periods in darkness and isolation created conditions ideal for inducing shared hallucinations and group psychosis. The cave environment, with its constant temperature, humidity, and lack of natural light cycles, disrupted normal circadian rhythms and created a state of psychological vulnerability that made members highly susceptible to suggestion and shared delusions. The disciples' beliefs took a darker turn when Thornfield announced that the Hollow Earth civilizations were preparing for a great convergence, a cosmic event that would allow worthy surface dwellers to join their underground brethren. However, this transformation required the complete abandonment of surface world attachments, including physical possessions, family relationships, and even individual identity. Members began a process of systematic self-erasure, destroying personal documents, photographs, and any items that connected them to their previous lives. The final phase of preparation involved what Thornfield called the descent ritual, where members would venture into the deepest explored sections of the cave system and remain there until they achieved complete spiritual transformation. These expeditions became increasingly dangerous as participants pushed deeper into unexplored passages, often becoming lost for days in the labyrinthine network. Several members never returned from these journeys, though Thornfield claimed they had successfully completed their transition to the Hollow Earth realm. When federal authorities finally investigated the community in 1956, they discovered that the entire group had vanished without a trace. The cave system showed signs of extensive habitation, with living quarters carved into the rock and elaborate murals depicting the disciples' vision of the Hollow Earth civilizations. Most disturbing were the detailed maps found throughout the caves, showing passages that extended far beyond what geological surveys indicated was possible. Some of these maps appeared to be drawn from perspectives that would have required the mapmaker to occupy positions deep within solid rock. 5. The Starlight Communion of Ravens Peak. In the high alpine meadows of North Carolina's Ravens Peak, where the mountain air grew thin and the night sky seemed close enough to touch, a former astronomer named Dr. Helena Vasquez established the Starlight Communion in 1963. Vasquez claimed to have received transmissions from an advanced alien civilization during her work at a government observatory, messages that revealed humanity's true purpose as caretakers of a cosmic experiment conducted by beings from the Vega star system. Her followers, primarily intellectuals and professionals seeking meaning in an increasingly complex world, believed they had found someone who could bridge the gap between science and spirituality. Vasquez's background in astrophysics lent credibility to her claims about extraterrestrial contact, and her ability to predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy convinced many that her alien contacts were genuine. The community constructed an elaborate observatory complex on the mountain's highest accessible point, using equipment that Vasquez claimed had been designed according to specifications received from her alien contacts. The installation included massive radio telescopes, optical instruments of unusual design, and what appeared to be transmission equipment capable of sending signals into deep space. Members spent their nights monitoring the heavens for signs of their cosmic benefactors, believing that consistent communication would eventually result in direct contact. Vasquez taught that humanity was being evaluated by multiple alien civilizations, with Earth serving as a testing ground for species development. The communion's purpose was to demonstrate that humans were ready for inclusion in a galactic community of advanced beings. This required not only technological advancement, but also spiritual evolution, achieved through rituals that combined astronomical observation with meditation practices designed to expand consciousness beyond normal human limitations. The nightly ceremonies took place in a circular chamber constructed at the observatory's center, where members would lie on specially designed platforms that aligned their bodies with specific stellar configurations. During these sessions, participants reported experiencing out-of-body travel to distant star systems, where they claimed to have direct conversations with alien entities who provided guidance on humanity's development. The experiences were so vivid and consistent among different members that many believed they were actually visiting those extraterrestrial realms. As the community's practices intensified, members began reporting physical changes that they attributed to genetic modifications being performed by their alien contacts. Their night vision improved dramatically, allowing them to observe celestial phenomena that were invisible to normal human eyes. Their sleep patterns shifted to match what Vasquez claimed were the natural rhythms of the Vega system, with members remaining active during specific planetary alignments and entering deep hibernation states during others. The communion's end came during what Vasquez had predicted would be the night of first contact, when their alien benefactors would finally reveal themselves to humanity. On the appointed evening in 1967, the entire community gathered in the observatory's central chamber, using their equipment to send a coordinated signal into space. Witnesses from nearby towns reported seeing an intense light emanating from Raven's Peak, a beam that seemed to extend upward into the night sky like a pillar of pure energy. When rescue teams reached the observatory the following morning, they found the facility completely abandoned. The equipment remained functional, but showed readings that suggested it had been operating at impossible energy levels during the final transmission. Most puzzling was the discovery that the mountain's peak had been altered, with the rock formation showing signs of intense heat exposure that had created a perfectly circular depression where the observatory's central chamber had once stood. 6. The final harvest ministry of Bone Valley. In the desolate hollow known as Bone Valley, where winter seemed to last 9 months and the summer sun never quite reached the valley floor, a charismatic preacher named Reverend Caleb Ashworth established the Final Harvest Ministry in 1978. Ashworth claimed to have received visions during a near-death experience, visions that revealed the true timeline of the apocalypse and humanity's role in preparing for Christ's return to Earth. His followers, drawn from the ranks of survivalists and religious fundamentalists who believed the end times were imminent, found in Ashworth a leader who seemed to possess genuine prophetic abilities. His predictions about world events proved unnervingly accurate, from economic crashes to natural disasters, convincing his congregation that he had indeed been chosen to guide the faithful through the final tribulation. The ministry's compound was constructed like a fortress, with high walls and guard towers designed to withstand both human attack and supernatural assault. Ashworth taught that the coming apocalypse would involve not only earthly catastrophes, but also the release of demonic forces that had been imprisoned since biblical times. The faithful would need to be prepared for warfare on both physical and spiritual planes, requiring training in combat techniques as well as advanced religious practices. Members underwent intensive preparation that combined military-style training with increasingly extreme religious rituals. Children were taught to handle weapons and survive in wilderness conditions, while adults practiced elaborate exorcism ceremonies designed to combat the demonic entities they expected to encounter during the final days. The ministry's arsenal included not only conventional weapons, but also items that Ashworth claimed had been blessed with supernatural properties, capable of destroying evil spirits and protecting the faithful from otherworldly threats. The community's practices grew more disturbing as Ashworth's visions became increasingly detailed and urgent. He announced that the final battle between good and evil would begin within the year, requiring the faithful to undergo a transformation that would prepare them for their roles as divine warriors. This process involved extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and exposure to psychological stress designed to break down normal human limitations and allow divine power to flow through them. The ministry's end came not through external intervention, but through an internal collapse that survivors described as divine judgment. On a cold winter night in 1981, as the community gathered for what Ashworth had proclaimed would be the final preparation ceremony, the compound was struck by a series of explosions that leveled every building simultaneously. The blasts occurred with such precision that investigators suspected the use of military-grade explosives, though no evidence of such materials was ever found. When emergency responders reached the site, they discovered that the explosions had created a pattern of destruction that seemed to follow no known principles of physics or engineering. The buildings had been reduced to rubble, but the debris was arranged in geometric patterns that suggested intelligent design rather than random destruction. Most disturbing was the discovery that the compound's underground bunkers, designed to withstand nuclear attack, had been completely vaporized, leaving behind only smooth-walled cavities that showed no signs of explosive damage. The fate of the ministry's members remained a mystery that haunted investigators for decades. No human remains were found in the wreckage, despite the fact that over 400 people had been present during the final ceremony. The only evidence of their existence was a series of personal items arranged in careful patterns throughout the debris, as if someone had deliberately placed them as markers or memorials. These 6 cults represent just a fraction of the religious movements that found refuge in Appalachia's remote valleys, where isolation and desperation created perfect conditions for charismatic leaders to establish their own kingdoms of faith and fear. Their stories remind us that the line between salvation and damnation has always been thinner than we'd like to believe, especially in places where the modern world's light has never quite managed to penetrate the ancient darkness. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the wind carries voices from forgotten hollows, locals claim they can still hear the echoes of prayers and screams from communities that chose to follow their prophets into realms from which no traveler returns. The caves remain, the valleys endure, and somewhere in the mist-shrouded peaks, the faithful may still be waiting for promises that were never meant to be kept. What disturbs me most about these stories isn't the violence or the tragedy, but the genuine faith of the followers who believed they had found something transcendent in these remote places. Their devotion was real, Their hope was genuine, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for their beliefs speaks to something fundamentally human that we all carry within us. The question that haunts me is this: in our search for meaning and purpose, how do we know when we've found salvation and when we've simply discovered another form of damnation? If you found yourself questioning your own beliefs while watching this, you're not alone. These stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, leadership, and the human need for belonging. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because next week we're exploring the abandoned towns these cults left behind and the strange phenomena that locals still report in places where the veil between worlds was torn too thin to ever fully heal. Until then, remember that sometimes the most dangerous journeys are the ones we take in search of ourselves.